You know the golden version, the wisest man who ever lived, the king who asked God for wisdom instead of riches and got both, the one who settled an impossible case between two women and a baby, who wrote thousands of proverbs, who built a temple so beautiful the whole ancient world came to stare at it. Solomon, the peak of Israel, the high point of the whole story. That's where most tellings stop. On the gold, on the wisdom, on the temple gleaming in the sun. A happy ending for the greatest king Israel ever had. There is just one problem with it. The Bible does not end Solomon's story on the gold. It ends it in the dark. Read the actual account of his last days, slowly, all the way to the end, and the wisest man in the world turns into something almost unbearable to watch. An old king with 1,000 wives, building altars to foreign gods on the hill facing his own temple. A ruler whose own God tells him to his face that the kingdom is going to be torn out of his family's hands. And a man who, by tradition, sat down near the end of his life and wrote a book that opens with the bleakest words in the entire Bible. Everything is vapor. Everything is meaningless. I have seen it all, and none of it matters. So, how does that happen? How does the wisest man who ever lived end up the single clearest example in the whole book of a wise man playing the fool? How does the king who asked for a listening heart end with a heart, the text says, quietly turned away? And why did the kingdom he spent 40 years building shatter into pieces almost the moment he was in the grave? To find out, we have to follow one man from the height of everything down to the bottom and read the 3 warnings he was given and broke one by one. Let's get into it. Decades before the shrines went up on that hill, Solomon was a young man kneeling in the dark, being offered anything he wanted and choosing the one thing almost nobody would. And it's worth knowing how this man's life began because of how far it travels. When Solomon was born to David and Bathsheba, the text says something tender. It says, "The Lord loved him." And God sent word through the prophet Nathan to give the baby a second name, a nickname from heaven, Jedidiah. In Hebrew it means beloved of the Lord. That's how Solomon enters the story. Not as the wise king yet, not as the builder of the temple, but simply as a child God loved and named beloved. Hold on to that name, because the distance between beloved of the Lord and the old king on the hill of foreign altars is the whole heartbreak of this story. Early in his reign, the story says, Solomon goes up to a place called Gibeon to worship, and while he's there, God appears to him in a dream at night and says something staggering. "Ask what I shall give you." A blank check from God to a brand new king. Ask for anything. And think about what a young ruler could ask for in that moment. Long life, or the death of his enemies, or wealth beyond counting, or power over every nation around him. Solomon asks for none of it. Instead, he says this, "I am only a little child. I do not know how to go out or come in, and your servant is in the middle of a people too many to count. So give your servant a listening heart to judge your people, that I may discern between good and evil." Stop on that phrase, because in the Hebrew it is beautiful, and it is the key to this whole tragedy. The words are Lev Shomea. Lev means heart, and Shomea comes from the verb shama, to hear, to listen. Solomon does not ask for a big brain. He does not ask to be clever. He asks for a hearing heart, a listening heart. A heart tuned to actually hear God and hear his people and tell the difference between right and wrong. And God is so pleased with the request that he does something extra. He says, "Because you asked for this, and not for long life or riches or the lives of your enemies, I am giving you a wise and discerning heart, like no one before or after you. And then, on top of it, I am also giving you the things you did not ask for, riches and honor, so that no king will compare to you all your days." The lesson lands hard and clean. Ask for the right thing, and everything else gets added. Solomon starts his reign getting the deepest thing in the story exactly right. And for a long stretch, it works. The wisdom becomes legendary. There's the famous case early on where two women come before him, each claiming the same baby, and Solomon calls for a sword and offers to cut the child in two, knowing the real mother will give the baby up rather than see it die. It's a trap, and it works, and word of it spreads through the whole land. People realize the wisdom of God is in this young king to do justice, and it does not stop at courtroom cleverness. The text says, God gave Solomon wisdom and understanding beyond measure, and breadth of mind, like the sand on the seashore. He speaks thousands of proverbs. He composes over 1,000 songs. He talks about trees and animals and birds and fish the way a naturalist would. Kings from other nations send people just to sit and listen to him. He becomes, in his own lifetime, the wisest man alive, and everyone around him knows it. Then comes the crown jewel, the temple. For 7 years, Solomon pours the wealth and craft of the entire kingdom into building a house for God in Jerusalem, overlaid inside with pure gold, carved with cherubim and palm trees and open flowers, filled with the smell of cedar and olive wood. When it's finished and the ark is brought in, the story says a cloud fills the house, the glory of God so thick the priests cannot even stand up to do their work. It is the high point of the entire Hebrew Bible. The moment the presence of God settles into a building made by human hands, and the wealth becomes almost cartoonish. Foreign rulers send tribute. Trade fleets bring back gold and silver and ivory and exotic animals. The most famous visitor of all, the Queen of Sheba, travels a vast distance just to test him with hard questions. And after she's seen his wisdom and his palace and his gold, the text says there was no more breath left in her. She was breathless. And she says, the half was not told me. Your wisdom and prosperity surpass everything I heard. And it wasn't only the visitors and the gold. Under Solomon, the whole nation exhaled. The text says Judah and Israel were as many as the sand by the sea, and they ate and drank and were happy. It paints a picture of a people finally at rest, every man sitting under his own vine and his own fig tree, from one end of the land to the other, in safety, all the days of Solomon. After generations of war under David, this was the peace they had bled for, a golden age in the fullest sense, which is exactly why what happens next is so hard to watch. The higher the kingdom climbs, the further it has to fall. So this is the picture everyone remembers. Wisdom, gold, temple, glory, a breathless queen, the absolute summit of the story. And if the account ended here, Solomon would be the cleanest happy ending in the Bible. But the account does not end here. And the reason it doesn't is hidden in a warning written down long before Solomon was ever born. Because centuries earlier, in the book of Deuteronomy, long before Israel even had a king, God laid down a set of rules for the day when they would want one. It's a short passage, easy to skip, called by scholars the law of the king. And it does something remarkable. It looks into the future at a king who does not exist yet, and it names the exact 3 things that will destroy him if he ever does them. 3 prohibitions. 3 lines a king of Israel was never supposed to cross. And here is the detail that turns Solomon's golden story into a tragedy. By the end of his life, Solomon has crossed all 3, not 1, not 2. All of them in order, more spectacularly than any king before or after. The wisest man who ever lived breaks the 3 specific rules written to protect the man in his exact chair. Hold on to that, because the order matters, and it builds. This is not a man who wakes up one morning and renounces God. It's slower than that, and quieter, and far more dangerous. It's the story of a wise man who thought the rules were for smaller men than him. And the first of those 3 lines, he crosses while everyone is still admiring the gold. So let's read the 3 warnings. And let's watch the wisest king in history walk straight into every single one. Here's what the law of the king actually says. When you come into the land and set a king over yourselves, the text says, he must not do 3 things, and the same Hebrew verb sits under all 3 of them. The verb is rabah. It means to multiply, to increase, to pile up in great quantity. 3 times God says, do not multiply. Warning number 1. The king must not multiply horses for himself, and above all, he must not send the people back to Egypt to get more horses. Warning number 2. He must not multiply wives for himself, and here the text adds the reason right there in the verse, so that his heart does not turn away. And warning number 3. He must not multiply silver and gold for himself in great excess. Horses, wives, and gold. 3 appetites that could bring a king down. And notice what the passage is really worried about, because it isn't the objects themselves. A horse isn't evil. Gold isn't evil. The fear is what happens to a man's heart when he stops trusting God and starts trusting his stockpile. Horses meant military power, the temptation to rely on your own army instead of God, and worse, to go crawling back to Egypt, the very nation Israel had escaped, to buy that power. Gold meant the temptation to worship your own wealth. And wives, especially foreign wives, meant the temptation the text names outright: a turned heart. Foreign women who would bring foreign gods into the house of the king. So keep those 3 in your head, exactly in that order. Horses, gold, wives. Because now we go back to the account of Solomon's reign, and we read it with these 3 warnings in one hand. And what you find is almost eerie. It reads less like a story and more like a checklist being ticked off, 1 box at a time. Start with the horses. The very same chapter that describes Solomon at the height of his glory, right after the Queen of Sheba leaves, tells you this: Solomon gathered chariots and horsemen. He had 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horsemen. And then, as if the writer wants to make absolutely sure you catch it, the text says exactly where the horses came from. Solomon's horses were imported from Egypt. He had traders going down to Egypt to buy them by the caravan load, and he turned it into a business, buying chariots and horses out of Egypt and selling them on to other kings. Read that against warning number 1. Do not multiply horses, and do not send the people back to Egypt for them. And here is Solomon, multiplying horses by the 1,000, running a supply line straight back to Egypt, the one direction the law specifically said never to go. Box 1 ticked, and nobody blinks, because it just looks like success. Now the gold. And this is where the number is so precise it almost sounds made up. The text says the weight of gold that came to Solomon in a single year was 666 talents. A talent is a staggering unit of weight, and 666 of them in gold every year is the kind of wealth that reshapes a nation. That's the kind of number that makes accountants cry, and the text piles it on. Solomon made silver as common in Jerusalem as stones. He made a throne of ivory overlaid with gold. He made drinking cups of pure gold, and the account notes, almost with a shrug, that none were of silver, because in the days of Solomon silver was considered nothing at all. Read that against warning number 2 on the list, the gold. Do not multiply silver and gold to great excess. And here is Solomon, so drowning in gold that he literally cannot be bothered to use silver. Box 2 ticked. And still, it all looks like blessing. It looks like the promise from Gibeon coming true, the riches God added on top of the wisdom. which is exactly what makes it so hard to see the danger. The gold and the horses were partly gifts, but Solomon didn't hold them like gifts. He multiplied them like a man who had forgotten who gave them. The third box is the one the law was most afraid of, the one with the reason attached. Do not multiply wives, so that his heart does not turn away. And this is where the number stops being impressive and starts being frightening. The text says Solomon loved many foreign women, and then it gives you the count. He had 700 wives, who were princesses, and 300 concubines. Do the arithmetic. 1,000 women. And these were not women from his own people. They were, the text is careful to list, Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, Hittites. Women from exactly the nations God had warned Israel about, the nations whose gods would pull their hearts away. 1,000 women, most of them carrying the worship of foreign gods into the household of the man who built the temple to the one God. Box 3 ticked. All 3 warnings, every single one written centuries earlier specifically for a future king, broken by the wisest king who ever sat on the throne. Horses from Egypt, gold beyond counting, and 1,000 foreign wives. He did not stumble into one of them. He ran the full table. And here's a piece of it that's easy to miss. Most of these marriages were not romance, they were politics. In the ancient world, the fastest way to seal a treaty between 2 kingdoms was for the kings to marry into each other's families. Solomon married the daughter of Pharaoh himself, the king of Egypt, as part of an alliance. Every foreign princess in his palace was, in a sense, a signed peace treaty with another nation. So Solomon could tell himself this was strategy, statecraft, the wise management of a great empire. Each marriage looked like a smart political move, and each one brought another foreign god and another shrine and another small pull on his heart, until the strategy had quietly become the thing that destroyed him. The wisest king in the world outsmarted himself one alliance at a time. And I want to be honest about something here, because it's the part that makes this a tragedy and not just a scandal. Solomon almost certainly knew the law of the king. This is the man famous for wisdom, for knowing the scriptures, for discernment. He would have known Deuteronomy chapter 17 better than anyone alive. He knew the 3 warnings, and he broke them anyway, one by one, apparently convinced that the rules that bound ordinary kings did not quite apply to a king as wise as him. And that is the most dangerous mistake a gifted person can make. A wise man who trusts his own wisdom so completely that he stops thinking the guardrails are for him. Because here is the thing the law saw coming, and Solomon did not. Of those 3 warnings, one of them had a fuse attached. The horses were a mistake, the gold was a danger. But the wives were a bomb, and the law told you exactly what the bomb would do, so that his heart does not turn away. That was the warning, and the turning of Solomon's heart is the saddest sentence in his entire story. Because the man who once asked God for a listening heart is about to be described in the plainest possible words with a heart that stopped listening. Here is how the account turns, and it turns on 4 small words that undo everything the golden chapters built. The text says, "When Solomon was old, his wives turned away his heart." Sit on that opening phrase, because it matters for a video about his last days. This is not the young king at Gibeon. This is Solomon at the end. An old man, decades into his reign, surrounded by everything a human being could want, and the thing the story chooses to tell you about his old age is not peace and not wisdom crowning a long life. It's a heart being pulled away from God. And watch the Hebrew here, because it echoes the warning perfectly. The word for what his wives did to his heart is nata. Nata means to stretch out, to bend, to incline, to turn something away from where it was pointing. His wives nata his heart. They bent it. They inclined it away from God, and toward their gods. And that is the exact word the law of the king reached for centuries earlier, when it said, "Do not multiply wives, so that his heart does not turn away." The warning used one word. The disaster uses the same word. The text is showing you the fuse burning down to exactly what it was always going to hit. And now put that next to the beginning. At Gibeon, the young king asked for a lev shomeah, a listening heart. Now, at the end, the old king has a lev nata, a heart turned away. The same word, heart, at both ends of his life. And in between, it went from listening to turning, from tuned toward God to bent toward everything else. That is the whole arc of Solomon in two Hebrew phrases. He asked for a heart that would hear. He ended with a heart that had stopped hearing. And he could not tell you the moment it happened, because it did not happen in a moment. It happened one wife, one altar, one compromise at a time. And here is the part that should genuinely stop you, because it's worse than most people realize. Solomon does not stop worshipping the God of Israel. That's the version people assume, that he flipped, that he became an idol worshipper and walked away from Yahweh. But the truth the text gives us is stranger and sadder. Solomon keeps the temple. He keeps the worship of the God of Israel. He just adds everyone else's gods alongside it. The text lists them by name. He goes after Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians. He goes after Milcom, also called Molech, the god of the Ammonites, a god associated in the Bible with the most horrifying practices imaginable. He builds a high place for Chemosh, the god of Moab, and for Molech of the Ammonites. And where does he build them? This is the detail that turns your stomach if you know the geography. He builds these shrines on the mountain east of Jerusalem, on the hill directly across the valley from the temple, the house of God on one hill, and the altars to Chemosh and Molech staring back at it from the next hill over, both built by the same king. That hill would carry the shame for centuries. Generations later, another king, a good one named Josiah, comes through and tears these shrines down, and by then the place has a name. In the book of 2 Kings, it's remembered as the Mount of Corruption, or the Mount of Destruction, the Hill of Ruin. And it got that name because of what an old, heart-turned Solomon built there in the last stretch of his life, in full view of the temple that was supposed to be his crowning achievement. Now, why would the wisest man on earth do something this reckless, this obviously wrong? And the answer is almost certainly not that he stopped believing. It's that he loved his wives, and he wanted to please them, and each one wanted a place to worship the God of her homeland. And Solomon, the great compromiser, the man who could always find the clever middle path, kept saying yes. One shrine for her, one high place for her, a little altar for that one, until the hill across from the temple was covered in them. Wisdom, it turns out, is not the same thing as faithfulness. You can be the smartest person in the room and still hand your heart away one small yes at a time. And the Bible itself, much later, looks back on this exact moment and uses it as a warning. Centuries after Solomon, the leader Nehemiah is trying to stop his people from marrying foreign wives who pull them toward other gods, and he reaches for the one example nobody could argue with. Did not Solomon, king of Israel, sin on account of such women? He says. Among the many nations there was no king like him, and he was loved by his God, and God made him king over all Israel. Nevertheless, foreign women made even him to sin, even him. That's how the rest of the Bible remembers Solomon's last chapter, as a warning. The proof that if it could happen to the wisest man alive, it could happen to anyone. Before we see what God does about all of this, one quick thing. If you're the kind of person who would rather read what the text actually says than the polished version from the picture books, subscribe. That's the whole point of this channel. Every week I take one story people are sure they already understand, and we go back to the original words to find what's really there. It genuinely helps these deeper readings reach people who've only ever heard the flattened version. All right, so the heart has turned. The altars are built. The wisest king in history is standing at the end of his life, having broken all 3 warnings and filled the hill across from God's house with foreign gods. And you cannot do that in this story without God responding. The question is how? And the answer comes to Solomon directly in words that must have landed like ice water. Because God tells him personally that the kingdom is going to be torn away. Not someday, vaguely. Torn. And the tearing is going to start the moment he's gone. The text says, "The Lord was angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the God who had appeared to him twice." Twice. That's the detail that makes this so heavy. God had not been distant with Solomon. He'd shown up in person at Gibeon at the start, and again after the temple was built, warning him directly to stay faithful. Solomon had more direct contact with God than almost anyone in the story, and he still turned. So this isn't the anger of a stranger, it's the grief of someone who had given this man everything and watched him walk away anyway. And that second warning had been terrifyingly specific. After the temple was finished, God had appeared to Solomon a second time and told him plainly what was at stake. "If you walk before me like your father David did," he said, "I will establish your throne forever. But if you or your children turn away and go and serve other gods, then I will cut Israel off from the land. And this house that I have made holy, I will cast out of my sight. And this temple, the very one you just built, will become a heap of ruins, and everyone who passes by will be shocked and will hiss." God had spelled it out. Serve other gods, and the temple becomes rubble. Solomon heard that from God's own mouth, and then went and built altars to other gods on the hill facing it anyway. And God speaks a sentence over him. "Because you have done this," he says, "and have not kept my covenant, I will surely tear the kingdom away from you and give it to your servant." Tear. Hold that word, because it's about to become a physical object you can see. But then, in the same breath, comes mercy, and it's aimed backward at Solomon's father. "Yet for the sake of David your father," God says, "I will not do it in your lifetime. I will tear it out of the hand of your son. And I will not tear away the whole kingdom. I will leave one tribe to your son, for the sake of David, and for the sake of Jerusalem, the city I have chosen." Read what that judgment actually is, because it's precise, and it's devastating in a quiet way. Solomon himself gets to keep the kingdom to the end of his life. He dies a king, on the throne, in the golden city. On the surface, nothing collapses while he's alive, but the sentence has been passed, and it lands on his son. The kingdom that David united, that Solomon glorified, is going to be ripped in two the instant Solomon's hand comes off it. He gets to keep his crown. His son inherits the wreckage. And that mercy, that delay, is only there because of David, the father, not because of anything Solomon did at the end. And you can feel the clock start ticking in the story now, because right after this, the text does something it hasn't done in Solomon's whole golden reign. It starts listing his enemies. For decades, everything had been peace and gold and tribute. Suddenly the account says God raised up adversaries against him. A man named Hadad, of the royal line of Edom, who had escaped a massacre as a child and now comes back to trouble Solomon from the south. A warlord named Rezon, who sets himself up in Damascus and becomes an enemy to the north. The empire that looked untouchable is suddenly surrounded by cracks, and the text is blunt that this is the judgment beginning to move. But the real threat isn't on the borders, it's inside the house. His name is Jeroboam, and he's one of Solomon's own officials, a capable young man Solomon himself promoted to oversee the labor force of one of the tribes. And what happens to Jeroboam is one of the most cinematic scenes in the whole account. Jeroboam is walking out of Jerusalem one day, alone, when a prophet named Ahijah meets him on the road. And Ahijah is wearing a brand new cloak, a new garment. And right there on the empty road, the prophet takes hold of that new cloak and tears it. He rips it into 12 pieces, and he turns to Jeroboam and says, "Take 10 pieces for yourself, because this is what God says. I am going to tear the kingdom out of the hand of Solomon and give 10 tribes to you." Watch what the text is doing. God had said, "I will tear the kingdom." And now a prophet stands on a road and physically tears a garment into 12 pieces and hands 10 of them to a stranger. The Hebrew for tear runs right through the scene, the same idea from God's sentence to Solomon, now acted out in cloth you can see and hear. The word became a picture, 10 pieces for Jeroboam, the kingdom's future, torn up on a roadside, while Solomon still sits on his golden throne, unaware that the man who will inherit 10/12 of everything he built just walked out of his own city with the future in his hands. And Solomon's response when he finds out tells you how far the wise young king of Gibeon has drifted. He doesn't repent. He doesn't tear his own robes in grief and turn back to God. He tries to kill Jeroboam. The man who once offered to give up a baby rather than see it harmed now sends assassins after a young official because a prophet said he'd inherit the throne. Jeroboam runs, escapes into Egypt, that same Egypt again, and waits there for Solomon to die. And the wisest man in the world spends the last of his energy not on wisdom, but on trying to murder his way out of a judgment he brought on himself. We've watched the kingdom get condemned, but we haven't yet been inside the old king's own head, and it turns out we have a record of that too. By tradition, Solomon left behind a book about exactly this, about what it feels like to have everything, and to know, at the end, that it turned to nothing in your hands. By the end of Solomon's life, the story of his reign has told you what he did. But tucked elsewhere in the Bible is a book that many have read as what he felt. It's called Ecclesiastes, and it may be the bleakest, most honest, most modern-sounding book in the entire Hebrew Bible. The book opens by introducing its narrator. The words of the teacher, it says, "The son of David, king in Jerusalem. Son of David, king in Jerusalem." For most of history, readers have understood that to mean Solomon, looking back at the end of a life in which he had more wealth, more wisdom, more pleasure, and more power than anyone alive. Now, I want to be honest and careful here, because this is where it's easy to overclaim. Many modern scholars think the Hebrew of Ecclesiastes was actually written down later, and that the book uses the voice of Solomon as a kind of frame, putting its hard-won reflection in the mouth of the king who most famously had everything. Whether Solomon literally penned it or the tradition wrapped it around him, the effect is the same, and it's deliberate. This is the wisest, richest king in the story, sitting in the ruins of his own satisfaction, telling you what it was all worth. And the Hebrew name for that narrator is worth stopping on because it's loaded. The word translated teacher or preacher is koheleth. It comes from a root that means to gather, to assemble, to collect. Koheleth is the gatherer, the one who assembles. And that is almost unbearably fitting, because Solomon was the great gatherer of the whole Bible. He gathered gold, he gathered horses, he gathered 1,000 wives. He gathered wisdom and proverbs and treasure and territory more than any person in the story. And the book written in his voice, the Gatherer's Book, is about discovering that everything you gather slips straight through your fingers. The book's very first line is one you've probably heard, usually in an old translation that gets it slightly wrong. "Vanity of vanities," it says. All is vanity. For centuries, people have read that word vanity and thought it meant pride or emptiness in a moral sense. But the Hebrew word is hevel, and hevel does not mean vanity. Hevel means vapor, breath, mist. The little puff of fog you can see on a cold morning that's there for a second and then gone. Some translate it as a breath or a wisp of smoke. So read the opening line again with the real word in it. Vapor of vapors. Everything is vapor, everything is breath, and mist and fog that burns off the second the sun hits it. That's the first thing the old king says. Not everything is sinful. Everything is fleeting. You reach for it, and your hand closes on nothing. That is the mood the wisest man in the world lands in at the end of his life, and it is a very long way from the breathless queen and the gold that made silver worthless. The book then does something that reads almost like a confession from the man himself. The narrator lists everything he tried, everything he built, everything he gathered in a desperate search for meaning. And the list is Solomon's own reign, point for point. I made great works, he says. I built houses. I planted vineyards. I made gardens and parks and pools of water. I gathered silver and gold and the treasure of kings. I had singers and every delight. I became great, greater than anyone before me in Jerusalem, and my wisdom stayed with me the whole time. Whatever my eyes wanted, I did not keep from them. And then, the verdict. After the whole list, the man who had literally everything a human being could acquire turns around and says this: Then I looked on all the works that my hands had done, and on all the labor I had spent doing it, and behold, all of it was hevel, a chasing after wind, and there was nothing to be gained under the sun. A chasing after wind. That's the other phrase that runs through the whole book, and it's perfect. It's the picture of a man running across a field trying to catch the wind in his hands. You can run as fast as you like. You can be as clever and as rich and as mighty as any king who ever lived, and you will never close your fingers on it. That is the old king's report on a life that had more than any life in the story. He got the wisdom. He got the gold. He got the temple and the wives and the fame. And at the end, looking back over all of it, the word he reaches for is vapor. And gold and work were not the only things he tried. The book walks through experiment after experiment, like a man testing every door in a mansion, looking for one that leads somewhere. He tried pleasure, wine, laughter, anything that felt good, and found it was vapor too. He tried great projects and possessions. Vapor. He even turned back to wisdom itself, the one thing he was famous for, and came to one of the most haunting lines in the book. In much wisdom is much grief, he says, and the one who increases knowledge increases sorrow. The wisest man in the world, concluding that even wisdom, past a certain point, just lets you see more clearly how little any of it lasts, and running underneath all of it is that famous, weary refrain: there is nothing new under the sun. What has been will be again. The rivers all run to the sea, and the sea is never full, round and round, generation after generation, and nothing you build finally stays. It's the sound of a man who has seen everything twice and can no longer be surprised by any of it. And this is the sad end the title of this video is pointing at. Not just that the kingdom got torn away. That was the outward loss. This is the inward one. The wisest man who ever lived, at the close of his days, sitting in the middle of everything he built, unable to feel that any of it meant anything. That's a darker ending than a lost battle or a fallen city. It's a man who won everything and still came up empty. And the terrible irony is that he had told you why at the very beginning, and then stopped listening to himself. He asked once for a listening heart. And somewhere in all the gathering, he stopped hearing the one voice that could have told him none of the gathering would ever be enough. But the book does not leave you there, in the fog. Because the old king, having chased the wind his whole life, finally turns around at the very end and says the one thing he learned. And it's the thing he'd been given at the start and lost, and had to lose everything to find again. The very last words of the gatherer's book: are not despair. After all the vapor, after all the chasing wind, the old king lands on one solid thing. The end of the matter, he says. All has been heard. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole of a person. That's it. That's the conclusion of a life that tried everything. Not gather more, not build higher. Fear God and keep his commandments. The exact thing the law of the king had asked of him back at the start, before the horses and the gold and the 1,000 wives. He spent a whole life and a whole kingdom learning the one line he already had on day one. And then the account of his reign closes, quietly, the way these things do. The rest of the acts of Solomon, the text says, and all that he did and his wisdom are written in the records. And Solomon slept with his fathers, and was buried in the city of David his father. He reigned 40 years, and his son Rehoboam became king in his place. 40 years on the throne, the golden age of Israel, and it ends in a single verse. He slept with his fathers. The wisest king lies down in the same ground as everyone else. And here is where the judgment God spoke comes due almost immediately, and faster than anyone expected. Because remember the sentence, I will tear the kingdom from your son. Solomon is barely in the grave when his son Rehoboam goes north to a town called Shechem to be confirmed as king by all the tribes. And Jeroboam, the man with the 10 torn pieces, comes back from Egypt to meet him there. And the people make one simple request. Your father Solomon made our burden heavy, they say. All that gold, all those building projects, all that splendor was paid for with brutal taxes and forced labor on the backs of the people. Lighten the load, they ask, and we will serve you. And there's a bitter irony buried in that complaint, because it reaches all the way back to the gold we admired at the start. All that splendor had a price, and the people had been paying it. To build the temple and the palace and the fortress cities, Solomon had drafted tens of thousands of his own people into forced labor gangs, work crews, hauling stone and timber year after year. The gleaming kingdom the Queen of Sheba marveled at was built on the backs of laborers who never forgot the weight of it. So when Solomon dies, the north doesn't come to Rehoboam with grief. They come with a bill. And Rehoboam, the son of the wisest man who ever lived, does the single most foolish thing in the entire story. He ignores the wise old counselors who tell him to serve the people and win their loyalty. He listens instead to his young friends, and he goes back to the people with the most arrogant answer imaginable. My little finger, he tells them, is thicker than my father's waist. My father laid a heavy yoke on you. I will make it heavier. My father disciplined you with whips. I will discipline you with scorpions. And that's it. That's the moment the kingdom dies. The 10 northern tribes look at this strutting boy king, and they turn their backs and walk away. What share do we have in David? They shout. To your tents, Israel, and they make Jeroboam their king. The 10 torn pieces of that cloak on the road become 10 tribes breaking away in a single afternoon. David's united kingdom, Solomon's golden empire, splits down the middle and never ever comes back together. Israel in the north, Judah in the south, 2 nations where there was one, forever. And look how fast it happened. God had said the tearing would come in his son's day, and it came in his son's first act as king. The prophet had torn a cloak into 10 pieces on a dusty road, and here were the 10 pieces walking away. Solomon's whole life had been about gathering, pulling more and more into his hands, and the very first thing that happens after his death is everything he gathered coming apart. The gatherer's kingdom scattered in an afternoon, exactly as promised, exactly on schedule. That's the sad end of the wisest king. It was something slower and quieter than a dramatic downfall. A heart that turned so gradually he never felt it go. A hill full of foreign altars facing the temple he built. A book full of fog where his joy should have been. and a kingdom that held together just long enough to bury him before it tore itself in two. The wisest man who ever lived, undone not by a lack of wisdom, but by the slow discovery that wisdom and faithfulness are two different things, and he had spent all his care on the first and almost none on the second. Which brings us all the way back around to where we started. We started this video with the golden version, the wisest man who ever lived, the temple, the gold, the breathless queen. A happy ending for the greatest king Israel ever had. And when we read the account all the way to the end, slowly, that version fell apart in our hands. We found a child God had named Jedidiah, beloved of the Lord, who grew into a young king who asked God for a listening heart, and got it, and got everything else on top. And then we found that same king, old, with a heart the text says had turned away, bent by 1,000 wives toward a hill full of foreign gods. We found the 3 warnings written centuries before he was born, the horses, the gold, and the wives, and we watched him break all 3 in order, apparently sure the rules were for lesser men. We found a kingdom sentenced to be torn in 2, a cloak ripped into 10 pieces on a road, and a book written in his own voice that looked back over all of it and called it vapor, a chasing after wind. The sad end of the wisest king was never really about losing the kingdom. That was just the outside coming apart. The real ending is quieter and heavier than that. It's a man who was handed the deepest wisdom in the world and used every bit of it on everything except the one thing that would have saved him. He could tell 2 women apart and find the true mother. He could name every plant and beast and outthink every king who came to test him, and he could not, in the end, keep his own heart pointed at God. He learned the one lesson that mattered: fear God and keep his commandments, only after a whole life of proving, the hard way, that nothing else in the world would ever be enough. That's the whole reason this channel exists. To open the book back up and read what's actually on the page, even when the truth turns out to be stranger, or sadder, or more human than the version we were handed. If this changed how you see even one story, subscribe, because next we're staying right here in these same chapters and following the 2 kings who inherited the wreckage, the son who lost 10 tribes with a single sentence, and the servant who caught them, and what he did with a kingdom that was never supposed to be his. And the video on screen right now unpacks another mystery hiding in these same pages. Go ahead and click it. I think you'll want to know how this one ends too.